On the blasted heath, 3 weird sisters speak prophecies that will poison Scotland. Salt and peat smoke stung the air as winded horses stamped on the damp heath, the sky hung low and bruised while the faint crack of distant horns threaded the mist. In that cold, a woman's whisper promised a crown, an impossible thought that settled in a warrior's bones like a stone, heavy and dangerous. Scotland in arms. Scotland in the age of warring thanes and warrior kings was a place where loyalty was the highest virtue and treachery the blackest sin. Macbeth had won his honor on battlefields that still smelled of iron and smoke, driving back English and Norwegian forces until songs were made of his courage. He was Duncan's dependable champion, a man whose blade had steadied a kingdom. When, after one such victory, Macbeth and his companion Banquo encountered 3 strange, haggard figures who greeted Macbeth as future king and Banquo as ancestor to kings, their words lodged like splinters in a mind already primed for glory. What began as a fleeting, uncanny promise would grow into an obsession that swallowed reason and obligation. The prophecy and the murder. All hail, Macbeth, that shalt be king hereafter. The witch's greeting cut like an accusation and an invitation at once. Duncan remained king, with heirs of his own, yet the phrase planted a possibility that the mind of a decorated warrior could not easily dismiss. Macbeth's letter to Lady Macbeth transformed private wonder into a domestic crisis. He confessed to the prophecy and his own bewildered longing, and she saw not fate's whim but a task to be completed. She understood Macbeth's strengths and his fatal softness. When Duncan announced he would rest at Macbeth's castle, she seized that moment as their doorway. Macbeth hesitated. Duncan was cousin, guest, sovereign, each tie forbade such betrayal. Lady Macbeth's scorn of his qualms, her cold arithmetic of power and appearances, and her willingness to dirty her hands to ensure success hardened him. When the household slept, Macbeth took the daggers and crossed the corridor to Duncan's chamber. The deed is done, but Macbeth's soul will never recover from this night's work. The act itself was stark and brutal, a throat cut in the dark, the slow spreading of blood over white linen. The physical simplicity of murder belied its spiritual devastation. Macbeth returned disordered and guilt-struck, clutching the instruments of the crime instead of leaving them as the guiltless survivors would do. Lady Macbeth, more composed in her cruelty, smeared the drugged guards with blood to implicate them and returned the weapons herself. Macbeth's cry, "Will all great Neptune's ocean wash this blood clean from my hand?" was not merely rhetorical, it was an acknowledgement that some stains are not mortal but moral, and no tide can remove them. By morning the castle erupted. Macbeth played the part of the grieving kinsman convincingly. Outrage, a swift and theatrical execution of the supposed murderers, and an outward fury that silenced immediate suspicion. Duncan's sons fled in fear, a motion that the realm read as guilt or cowardice, and by the day's end Macbeth wore the crown. The throne, however, felt more like a cell than a prize, the weight of kingship nothing compared to the weight of the crime that had placed it there. The reign of blood. The witch's second sting came with the prophecy that Banquo's descendants would inherit the throne. To realize that his sacrifice might crown another man's children was intolerable. Macbeth's ambition curdled quickly into paranoia. He moved from lone sinner to architect of a reign of terror, outsourcing murder to hired blades in an attempt to erase the threat to his legacy. The dead do not stay dead. Banquo's ghost drives Macbeth toward madness before the entire court. Banquo fell, but Flancay escaped into the night. The failure unhinged Macbeth in public. At a banquet intended to display his authority, he saw a bloodied Banquo in his seat, an apparition visible only to him, and his unraveling played out before the court. He raved at an empty place, he pleaded with the dead. Lady Macbeth smoothed over his fits by attributing them to illness, but nobles recoiled. The king's mind, once a fortress of discipline, now betrayed him as if guilt were a visible disease. Macbeth's desperation grew. He returned to the witches, demanding certainty, and their riddles both tempted and misled him. "Beware Macduff, no man born of woman shall harm you, you will not fall until Birnam Wood moves to Dunsinane." The last 2 oracles read as absolutes. The first, however, singled out a living opponent. Macbeth struck preemptively, sending murderers to Macduff's home. Macduff had already fled to England, the assassins butchered an innocent household instead. That massacre, women and children slain for a king's insecurity, became the point at which the country, and many of the thanes, could no longer ignore the nature of Macbeth's rule. Lady Macbeth's fall. Lady Macbeth had been the iron will behind the plot, a woman who dissolved moral hesitation into pragmatic resolve, who dismissed conscience as weakness. Yet the same resolve that soothed her husband's doubts could not protect her from the consequences of what they had done. The act of murder had apparently hardened her, but the soul remembers what the body tries to forget. Out damned spot, Lady Macbeth's guilt has consumed the woman who once mocked her husband's conscience. She began to sleepwalk, fingers attempting to scrub non-existent blood from invisible palms. Out damned spot, she whispered into empty corridors, confessing with a tortured candor that waking propriety would have suppressed. Her attendants watched helplessly as her mind replayed the night of Duncan's murder over and over, each replay another fracture in her sanity. Physicians and servants could do little, the disease was inward, an erosion of self that treatment could not touch. When news came that she had died, some accounts suggest by her own hand, Macbeth's reaction was not a storm of grief but a hollow meditation on life's futility. The union that had once made them formidable had dissolved, she into silence, he into a shell of stoic rage. The fall of the tyrant. As Macbeth clung to the witch's assurances, Malcolm marshaled support in England and Macduff rallied those who could still be rallied in Scotland. The prophecy's final scene arrived not as mystical intervention but as cunning tactic. Soldiers in Malcolm's host cut branches from Birnam Wood and marched behind them, so Dunsinane's lookouts seemed to watch the forest itself approach. The prophecy was fulfilled in the most literal sense possible, and the fortress of Macbeth's confidence began to crack. The final prophecy unravels. Macduff untimely ripped faces the tyrant who murdered his family. On the battlefield, Macduff confronted Macbeth for personally slaughtering an innocent family and for all the betrayals that had followed. Macbeth, clinging to the witch's supposed invulnerability, no man born of woman, met Macduff only to learn that the enemy was, from his mother's womb, untimely ripped. The loophole sealed the tyrant's fate. Macbeth fought with the grim valor of a man who remembered his old self, and he fell by a combination of righteous fury and exhausted skill. Macduff produced Macbeth's head to prove the end of a reign built on blood, and Malcolm ascended as the realm's rightful king, promising to restore order and law.